Welcome to MSD at Home. Tonight we present a panel discussion in our series on politics and utopia in architecture as part of Melbourne Design Week 2021. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the ancient lands on which we all virtually gather for this panel, the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all work today and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who might also be watching and participating in this webinar. We acknowledge that the land, sea and sky were never ceded and pay our deepest respect to their elders, past, present and future. With our series, Politics and Utopia, we argue that architectural practice and thinking is and always has been fundamentally political. We suggest that architects, while dealing with the many contemporary crises that they face, hold the chance and responsibility to propose and work on a better future for all. Hence the utopia in the title. As part of our series of panels, we are hosting tonight the presentation and discussions under the topic, Knowing the Anthropocene. My name is Dr. Peter Raisbeck and I'm co-convening tonight's panel together with my colleague, Associate Professor Rochus Hinkel.
Good evening, my name is Rochus Hinkel and I also like to welcome you all here in the panel and everyone's watching to tonight's discussion. We humans have made such an impact on our geology and ecosystems that a new geological epoch, the Anthropocene, has been declared. Unfortunately, while human conditions in terms of health and wealth have overall improved on a global scale, our planet has suffered through us to the extent that the whole species and ecosystems are failing. It is called the world's sixth mass extinction, which means that the Earth will lose 3/4 of our species. The building and construction industry is one of the largest CO2 polluters in the world, according to the World Green Building Council and its Global Status Report from 2017, meanwhile 4-year-old. The building and construction industry are responsible for 39% of all carbon emissions in the world, with operational emissions from energy used to heat, cool and light buildings accounting for 28%. The remaining 11% comes from embodied carbon emissions or upfront carbon that is associated with materials and construction processes throughout the whole building life cycle. So with around 40% of the world's CO2 output each year, we as architects have to radically change our thinking about the profession, our role, and the frameworks we are operating in. We all know that, at least to some extent, but it seems we avoid to act accordingly, or maybe we are unable to imagine a new world. Is the challenge too big? Is it impossible? Or do we simply ignore the facts and keep doing business as usual?
Following on from that, we'd like to ask tonight, how should architects respond and adapt to the Anthropocene? Fundamentally, we're asking about the future of architecture and the future of humanity. And from our guests, we will hear field stories that demonstrate how we might care for a damaged planet. If our human experience of the Anthropocene is one of grief because of ecological loss, how do we then remake our future through healing? And before we go on, we might just say a few comments about our role as co-conveners and before we introduce the panel. I think fundamentally, Rochus and I see these panel discussions as an opportunity to bring difficult topics into the discourse, raise awareness, and build an ongoing engagement and discussion within our school at MSD, within the broader architectural profession, and even across global societies. As facilitators, we are here very much to learn and listen from our guests, to learn from each other, and we'll be excited to admit and talk about our own struggles with engaging with these complex and wicked environmental, sociological, and political topics. Rochus and I, as much as we like to think we are experts, we don't claim to be experts, and we're seeing these discussions very much as a platform for exchange, activism, and learning.
So this series, Politics in Utopia and Architecture, derives from exploration I have been undertaking and invited Peter as well in the pedagogical context of Studio 40, a graduate design studio here at Melbourne School of Design. It is important and necessary that we raise these questions in our architecture schools across the country and internationally. In Studio 40, we want to acknowledge the numerous challenges we face and develop creative and utopian proposals in response. These challenges include the loss of biodiversity and the extinction of indigenous species, industrial food production, the shortage of water, and our climate catastrophe. Students engage with and try to learn from indigenous knowledge systems in order to create meaningful and holistic relationships to country. We also question existing socio-political and environmental frameworks and ask how our worlds could be different. Proposals range from sanctuaries and nurseries for indigenous species to indigenous food production, from places for creative artistic expression to cultural exchange, education, and learning. So the virtual space we are sitting here tonight at the panel discussion is part of a design proposal by Dylan Newell, a master student in Studio 40, and we're sitting in a nursery and sanctuary for indigenous species.
Tonight, we're very excited to have an illustrious list of guests with us. And firstly, from Santa Cruz, I'd like to welcome Anna Tsing. Anna is Professor for Anthropology at the University of California, Santa Cruz. One of her recent books is The Mushroom at the End of the World, on the possibility of life in capitalist rooms. Between 2013 and 18, she was Niels Bohr Professor at Aarhus University, where she co-directed the Aarhus University Research on the Anthropocene unit with Nils Bubandt. Feral Atlas, her project emerged as an Aura project. It quickly spread to include many dedicated collaborators whose presence has been an amazing and undeserved gift. Thank you so much, Anna, for joining us tonight.
I welcome from the Northern Arizona University, Alder Keleman, Saxena. Alder is a trained environmental anthropologist and an assistant research professor. Her research has examined the relationships linking agricultural biodiversity to human food cultures in Mexico and Bolivia, drawing connections between locally specific ethnobotanical and biocultural practices and larger political economic contexts. Her recent research and writing explores the social and material implications of the extension of digital connectivity to geographically remote spaces. Welcome, Alder. Good to have you here with us tonight.
And it also gives me great pleasure to welcome from the Melbourne School of Design, Hélène Frichot. Hélène is Professor of Architecture and Philosophy and Director of the Bachelor of Design at our Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning at the University of Melbourne in Australia. She is also a guest professor and the former Director of Critical Studies in Architecture at the School of Architecture, KTH, Stockholm in Sweden. Her recent publications include Dirty Theory, Troubling Architecture, and of course the one that I've got under my pillow, Creative Ecologies, Theorising the Practice of Architecture, which was published by Bloomsbury in 2018. And thank you so much for being a part of this panel, Hélène.
And last but not least, I welcome Charity Edwards. She's lecturer at Monash University's Department of Architecture, where she focuses on interdisciplinary teaching across architecture, interior architecture, and urban planning and design. She's a member and co-founder of the Afterlives of Cities. That should be our next topic, Peter, Afterlives of Cities.
Yes.
Research collective, which brings together expertise in architecture, astrophysics, digital fabrication, speculative fiction, and art installation to recover futures in space. Charity's own research explores the destructive, uneven, and more than human impacts of urbanization at the scale of the planet. She foregrounds the long disregarded space of the ocean in these processes in particular, and is currently investigating how this manifests in the Southern Ocean via increasingly autonomous underwater technologies. Welcome, Charity.
And tonight, the panelists will each give a short presentation about their experiences, practices, thoughts, and knowledge in regards to some of these issues regarding the Anthropocene. And we're hoping to have a very vivid exchange of ideas and discussions. And herewith, I'd like to hand over to Anna and Alder, who I should mention are both editors of Feral Atlas, and they are prepared and will share with us a video outlining their thinking and approach. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for inviting us today to present our new project, Feral Atlas, the More-Than-Human Anthropocene, and I hope the viewers will explore this project by themselves at feralatlas.org. This project is the result of a collaboration in which architects work together with social scientists, natural scientists, and artists to present a new view of the Anthropocene. We talk about the patchy Anthropocene. The place specificity seemed necessary to not only understand ecological processes, but also environmental justice issues. Besides place specificity, we imagine the patchy Anthropocene as involving patches of knowledge making that include indigenous spokespeople from the global South, and BIPOC scholars from metropolitan areas. To show you our project, we're going to show a little video that Beatrice Galilei and Satomi Blair made for us that is just an introduction to the project and hopefully an inducement for all of you to take a look later. I'm Lowenhaupt Tsing, one of the makers of Feral Atlas, the More-Than-Human Anthropocene. Working with software genius Nikki Tesla, co-editors Jennifer Dager, Alder, Keleman, Saxena, Feifei Zhou, and I assembled a group of more than 100 natural and social scientists, humanists, poets, and artists to offer a new approach to the current world condition of environmental catastrophe. Mixing genres and disciplines, we show you the social and ecological patchiness of the Anthropocene rather than a unified planetary situation. Using visual and digital magic, we offer stories of environmental injustice, radical diversity, and scientific surprise. In what follows, we'll introduce our project with 4 of our feral protagonists: a cow, a pesticide-spewing crop plane, a virus-carrying mosquito, and a radioactive blueberry. Explore our site at feralatlas.org. To know the terrible predicaments of our time, we hope you'll allow yourself the awe of stories. We hope our project inspires wonder in the midst of dread.
The introduction of pasture grass through European colonization has long-lasting consequences for Latin American landscapes. In eastern Panama, pastures prevent forests from growing back. Pastures also prevent Black and indigenous communities from controlling land. During my research in eastern Panama, many Emberá, Hunan, and Afro-Darianitas expressed great appreciation for the forest that used to grow. The colonists, on the other hand, who began to arrive in large numbers in the 1970s, preferred to cut the forest down. Many of them aspired to become ranchers, and many planted grass without having yet acquired cattle. Pastures enabled colonists to make legal claims on the land by showing that they had transformed forests into private property that could generate capital. And this supported the state's project to integrate eastern Panama to the national economy. But pasture grasses also spread without humans when their seeds are carried by the wind or by animals. And even though state planners had designated specific zones for cattle raising, the grass followed a different route, along the same highway that also brought colonists into the region. Along the highway, the secondary growth in fallow fields became vulnerable to grass invasion not only because of the field's ecological conditions, but also because of its legal classification as unproductive land. By preventing fallow fields from regrowing into forest, imported pasture grass enabled the dispossession of Black and indigenous communities and the transfer of land to colonists.
Feral Atlas shows how imperial and industrial infrastructures of the last 500 years have feral effects, human-caused but outside of human control. The great programs for the conquest of the earth promised modern ease and happiness, but in their inattention gave us a heap of terrifying, if unevenly spread, disasters. The Anthropocene is a world-ripping condition continually detonated by programs that have remade land, water, and air. Feral Atlas identifies 4 of these programs, which we call invasion, empire, capital, and acceleration. This landscape by Feifei Zhou illustrates capital. We see glittering cities and squalid slums, and all around the commodification of earthly goods and labors for the profits of distant investors. Feral effects proliferate, from global warming and toxic fogs to pests and plagues. Zhou's illustration shows the historical conjuncture that has led to capitalism as a landscape-modifying project. Explore the terrain, and you will find the feral entities whose stories are told in Feral Atlas, including our cow. The landscape also opens into another way of knowing the disasters of the Anthropocene, that is, through the work of infrastructures in transforming social relations and ecologies. Click on any feral entity, and you'll be transported into a meditation on how imperial and industrial remakings of the earth have made a systems-changing difference. Short videos, like this one by Armin Linke, focus starkly on infrastructural work. Here we see our cow subjected to the kind of work we call grid, the ecological simplification and discipline that rules agribusiness with so many feral effects.
Agricultural chemicals are quintessentially feral. They are virtually impossible to contain in space. They are constantly changing in interaction with living organisms, and they are notorious for defying the regulations meant to control them. My name is Elisa Paredes, and my entry in Feral Atlas was based on immersive field research on the banana plantations of Mindanao in the southern Philippines. Twice a week in this part of the world, bright yellow planes loaded with chemical fungicides fly over patchworks of banana fields and residential lands. The planes leave chemical trails that dissipate into the environment in the blink of an eye. When you're on the plantation, you can't see the drift exactly, but you do sense it. You sense it right inside of you, sitting between your nasal cavities and the front of your skull. Fungicidal drift is feral in the sense that it's both everywhere and nowhere at once, always lurking. This is the everyday reality of Mindanaoans who live near industrial farms. It's also a quality replicated on the Anthropocene detonator landscape, which helps visitors to the website experience virality for themselves. People have many presumptions about pesticides. Because they are non-living matter, just a composition of lifeless chemicals, we think they're unchanging. Because they're man-made, we assume they stay within our control. Because they are a product of modern innovation, we invest in the idea that the benefits to humanity outweigh the costs. And because there are regulations in place, we believe that there's nothing to worry about. These are the kinds of assumptions that the more-than-human Anthropocene demands that we challenge. On Mindanao's banana plantations, synthetic fungicides come up against virulent pathogens, partners, if you will, like the disease-causing black sigatoka fungus, which the pesticides are meant to control. When the fungus is empowered by the conventions of plantation agriculture, it becomes a truly formidable foe that can make pesticides ineffective over time. To deal with this situation, plantations have started applying fungicides not as solo chemicals, but in rotating concoctions called chemical cocktails. These cocktails confuse the fungus from developing resistance to any one agrochemical. But they also confuse people and serve an important political purpose that way. Residents have no clear idea what is being sprayed when, and environmental activists cannot isolate the evidence that's necessary for making sound legal or scientific arguments in their defense. So the aerial spraying of fungicides continues. Plantation corporations continue to insist that it's the safest mode of chemical application. Civil society attempts to seek legal action have been inspiring, but so far they've also failed. Near banana plantations in other parts of the world, scientists have found pesticide traces in the blood of wildlife, including pesticides that have been legally banned as long as a decade ago. The banana plantations of the Philippines may feel like faraway places, but the same logics of capital have shaped a great many landscapes in very similar ways.
All the field reports in Feral Atlas are based on observation and research. While we play with the imagination, we do so grounded in empirical details about the world. The contributors take their research seriously. The project is a contribution to science and rigorous scholarship, as well as to the arts. Even Joe's 4 fantastical landscapes, like this one, which illustrates the Anthropocene detonating conjunctures that we call empire, are collages full of historical reference. Let's start on the high ground at the bottom of your screen. Here are the Laotian poppy fields that helped fund the U.S. Indochina War. And here, on the left, are the Burmese teak plantations essential to British colonial rule. There's George Orwell shooting an elephant. Different places, different periods, but taken together, they show us the kind of landscape modifications through which empire detonates the Anthropocene. Moving downhill, upwards on your screen, you see the Netherlands East Indies 19th century cultivation system, which spread poverty and violence by forcing Javanese peasants to grow sugarcane for the metropole on their own subsistence fields. Sugarcane in many places rushes us toward the Anthropocene. You'll find it on all our detonator landscapes. Move toward the coast, and our reference switched to the sugarcane-hungry land grabs of Mozambique, and then the palm oil of West Africa, as illustrated by Ghanaian British architect Larry Botchway. Smallholders grow this imperial commodity, but their autonomy is constrained by contracts, which force them to exploit themselves in all the worst legacies of the plantation. Move farther toward the coast, and step back into the Atlantic trade in kidnapped and enslaved human beings sent to the New World to grow that infamous sugar cane, among other things. Here is a ship on which bodies were bound and stacked as if they could be considered property. It looks like the Mosquito is headed there.
One of the exciting things about research is finding out something you had not imagined beforehand. You start with a big story. For example, many African Americans like me grow up with the story of the Middle Passage. But the story doesn't end there. As I began to focus on the conditions that millions of Africans were forced to endure, crammed into the hulls of ships, held captive sometime for months at a time, I could not get beyond the images of enslaved people tightly packed, chained together. I started to think about the filth and unhealthiness of those ships as an ecology. But something had the freedom to move about and in fact thrived in the moist and stifling environment of the ship's hold. It was the Aedes aegypti mosquito. This virus-carrying pest relied upon the drinking water held on board, and it transformed during the journey, evolving into something different from what it had been in the old world. This human-loving mosquito changed the New World ecology by introducing diseases such as the yellow fever virus. Transformed by the horrendous trade in human beings, this strain of mosquito emerged to become a global pest.
Drawing is a critical tool to analyze the spatial effects of our built environment. My name is Feifei Zhou, another co-editor of Fair Atlas and the maker of these detonator landscape drawings. To visualize the Anthropocene, it helps, from time to time, to place ourselves into imaginative positions of specific socially and historically situated individuals, whether human or non-human. This drawing you're looking at, titled Acceleration, looks at the world from a marine animal's point of view, and from below. The cluster of plastic waste threatens your livelihood, intoxicate your bodies. Cross-scale representations provide a useful way to form critical analysis on how fair effects were formed and spread on various scales. To understand the global effects of antimicrobial resistance on human bodies, we need to understand something as domestic as industrial pork factories, and as microscopic as antibiotics. Scales help us to bridge connections between the seen and the unseen. Collaboration with BIPOC artists form an important part of the landscape drawings. The collage from contemporary artwork by Filipino duo Amy Lien and Enzo Camacho shows this mythological figure called Monalongo, which represents an intangible but unstoppable force that is guiding us in the world of acceleration. She's lingering on top of this industrial soy farm in the Philippines, but her legs are caught up in the plastic jungle. Just as with us, there's nowhere to hide. It's crucial for BIPOC artists to tell their own stories, especially those built on violence and exploitation.
In northern Ukraine, people have long made a living from the forest, hunting, fishing, picking berries and mushrooms. In 2014, berry picking in the Pripyat marshes leapt to an industrial scale. Researching a book on Chernobyl, I went picking too and followed the berry buyers to the warehouse. There, a radiation monitor waved a wand over the boxes. All the berries were radioactive. About half were over permissible levels, but the wholesalers bought them anyway. Turns out, they mix high-count berries with low-count ones to stay below the EU threshold. Berry bushes are brilliant at fixing radioactivity in their vascular networks. I found working through Soviet archives that before the Chernobyl plant was even built, the Pripyat marshes were already contaminated from nuclear testing in the 1960s. There you have it, Chernobyl in our breakfast bowls and Fukushima in our fish fries. The spread of radioactivity stands in for the many kinds of feral processes that add up to environmental catastrophe.
Through the method of storytelling from first-hand empirical observations, Fairer Atlas wants you to see the world in a different perspective. Observe around you. Fairer effects are everywhere. It's the aim of the Atlas to set out a new trajectory for studying the Anthropocene, with scientists and humanists working closely together to uncover the non-design effects of infrastructures. We hope that our radical transdisciplinary method can inspire more collaboration, not only between natural and social scientists, but also among artists, architects, and educators, thus offering multiple perspectives to study this intricate and sometimes terrible world of ours.
So I will go ahead and follow that video. I am Alder Keleman Saxena. I'm an environmental anthropologist and one of the co-editors of the Feral Atlas project. Following the video you've just seen, I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about the process of making Feral Atlas. This video overview, as you know, was generously shared with us by the producers of The World Around. And the film takes the viewer through a slow, lingering, up-close examination of the visual representations that anchor Feral Atlas. This careful practice of observation is at the core of what we hope to cultivate in Feral Atlas readers. And I think that talking through some of the challenges of designing a platform that would cultivate this kind of attention in a digital medium may help in positioning the project within the theme of the panel, Knowing the Anthropocene. It is no exaggeration to say that when we started work on Feral Atlas in the spring of 2017, we didn't really know what we were building. Of course, we did know some things. We had a vision, largely derived from Anna's insights, of what we wanted the project to be. We wanted it to be Atlas-like in its scope. We wanted it to use granular, research-based case studies to demonstrate the emergence of feral creatures and processes. And we wanted to use digital media to create a visually compelling, interactive interface. Similarly, we also had a vision of what Feral Atlas should not become. We did not want it to be a simple cartographic mapping project, tagging or locating entries on a single map. And while we wanted Feral Atlas to be interactive, we wanted to use the capacities of the digital form to channel the user's attention and advance an argument. We thought of this in opposition to what Anna has described as the everything links to everything aesthetic of the internet, which drives users to endless distracted clicking and can so easily get in the way of focused, in-depth analysis. The challenge was that we could find no existing academic publication model that would accommodate these goals. We asked each other, was this an e-journal, a blog, an exhibition-type website, a journalism project? In the end, none of these models seemed quite right. We came to the conclusion that to achieve what we had set out to do, we would need to build the form of the project from scratch. But this turned out to be more easily said than done. We found ourselves researching CMSs, or content management systems, a term none of us was previously familiar with. If you're unfamiliar too, think of WordPress as one example of the kind of platform that can be built upon to house content on the internet. Alongside this research, we had multiple conversations with our home university's IT departments about where on their servers our project might live over the long term, who might maintain it, at what cost, and whether the university's chosen CMS could be modified to fit the kind of project we were describing. Effectively, we had a crash course in the architecture of the internet. We learned that, as infinitely flexible as digital media may seem, there was no easy, ready-made way to conjure the form that we were envisioning. In the end, two developments saved us from endless floundering. One was the relationship with Stanford University Press's digital project section and our insightful editor, Frederica Sundaram. And the other was meeting two talented web designers, Nikki Tesla and Andrew Herzog. The press provided a permanent server home for Feral Atlas and the structure of a peer review system to give it academic legitimacy. Nikki and Andrew, meanwhile, joined us for multiple design workshops, listened to our ideas, tolerated our whiteboard sketched designs, and patiently explained to us what was possible and what was not. To continue the metaphor of the architecture of the internet, they took our vision and figured out how to fit it around the critical structural elements of web design. Did it turn out exactly as we had envisioned? In some ways, yes, and in other ways, no. But I think there is a broader learning from this experience that might help to think about the relationship between knowledge and design for the Anthropocene. Standards of internet design and its underlying architecture are set up to order knowledge in a particular way. One thing we noticed in spending time with websites that addressed similar topics to ours was that web design is often arranged to offer, or at least suggest, instant accessibility of all points within a site from any other point. Think, for example, of drop-down menus or menu icons that are visible from every page. Effectively, the architecture of the internet invites us all to see like a state, enabling, if not mastery itself, then a sense that mastery of a universe of information is possible, and just a few clicks away. These standard forms indeed make websites accessible and navigable, and in the end, at the urgings of our collaborators, we were persuaded not to jettison the principle entirely from Feral Atlas. Through long discussions, our designers helped us find ways to make the site legible and navigable while enhancing rather than disrupting the project's main arguments. But moving beyond the specifics of our project, this experience brings me to issues of knowledge and alterity, perhaps also touching on the themes of Indigenous design and climate change, which animate the conversations around Melbourne Design Week. The experience I describe reminds me to some extent of writings on the encounter between traditional ecological knowledge and formal science. Writings in this field some 20 years ago pointed out that often the kinds of Indigenous knowledge which are most easily taken up by formal scientific frames are precisely those which are easily translatable within dominant frames of knowledge and power. Knowledges that are less easily legible, or which require questioning the fundamental assumptions underpinning Western scientific epistemology, are more easily lost or ignored. I won't take this metaphor too far. Feral Atlas, of course, is not the functional equivalent of a dispossessed Indigenous group. It was put together by a well-resourced group of scholars with the support of numerous funding sources and institutions. But I do think there is something here which is relevant to larger questions of how alterity, whether Indigenous knowledge, feminist theory, or the lived experiences of urban minorities, might enter into design conversations. Which expressions of alterity are legible enough so as to be easily incorporated into our built surroundings, and which are so different as to be easily missed or ignored? What kinds of foundational perspectives, like, for example, the driving assumption that human mastery of the earth is a desirable and achievable goal, might we need to question in order to design worlds otherwise? I will leave it here with these questions and look forward to the other presenters' talks.
Thank you very much, Alder. Excellent. It's really fascinating listening to you and seeing this amazing format of storytelling and touching us on a different level than an academic paper format, but still having all these valuable arguments and knowledge in there. Can I invite Hélène Frichot from MSD for her presentation or comments, and then this will be followed by Charity, and then we start a conversation amongst the panelists and a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Rochus. So many of us in Melbourne are sitting on the lands of the Wurundjeri peoples, and we've earlier paid our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Right now, we're also, albeit virtually, sitting on the lands of the Dja Dja Wurrung in the vicinity of a town called Daylesford. In fact, we're sitting in a field, but inside an aviary designed by Dylan Newell for the protection of endangered Indigenous species. And Peter, you and I, we both have companion species, birds sitting on our name plaques. They are handsome regent honey eaters. And there are supposedly only about 250 left in this region. They've been disappearing as their woodlands have been encroached upon. How might we tell their story? This place, these diverse places on which we all presently sit, demand, as we've heard from the Feral Atlas, the telling of stories, the collecting of field notes, often also informed, well, importantly, informed by embodied experiences and our situated knowledges. And it seems that if we are able to listen carefully enough, if we pay attention, to use a slogan from Anna Tsing, there are many lessons to be learned also for design thinkers and doers, for architects. So one way of knowing the Anthropocene, the topic we are addressing today, is by developing knowledge practices that entail ethical storytelling. But care must be taken in this storytelling, and care furthermore, or what I would like to identify as a feminist ethics of care, including its important genealogy and attendant practices, turns out to be one of the themes that have been singled out by the organisers of this year's Melbourne Design Week. This year's Melbourne Design Week is dedicated to this notion or this provocation to design the world you want, with the sub-themes of care, community and climate. This, of course, begs the question, who are you? And isn't the problem exactly that we have been designing the world we human wants for way too long, for, you know, the world that we humans want for way too long now? But let's take practices of care and storytelling and place them side by side. When Deborah Bird-Rose and Tom Van Duren discussed the practice of storying in their beautiful 2016 essay, Lively Ethnography, Storying Animist Worlds, they intermix an expository mode with a performative one, in which storytelling looms to the fore. Their aim is to find stories that counter the violence and loss experienced in too many environments today. They're interested in ethos, understood as a style or way of life. They acknowledge how ways of life collectively produce an ethos, which is like an entanglement of habits and habitat, what I like to call environment worlds. Importantly, they explain the ethical delicacy required in the storytelling mode. And I want to quote them here. So this is Deborah Bird-Rose and Tom Van Duren, and I quote, "The intention here is not to slip into the hubris of claiming to tell another's stories, but rather to develop and tell our own stories in ways that are open to other ways of constituting, of responding to, and in a living world. In this context, stories are powerful tools for connectivity thinking. Unlike many other modes of giving an account, a story can allow multiple meanings to travel alongside one another. It can hold on to possibilities and interpretations and can refuse the kind of closure that prevents others from speaking or becoming." Unquote. The late Deborah Bird-Rose's work also appears in Elaine Gunn, Anna Tsing, Heather Swanson and Nils Bubandt's Arts of Living on a Damaged Planet, which, with works like Anna Tsing's The Mushroom at the End of the World and the more recent, truly wondrous open online platform that we've heard about today, this great experiment that is the Feral Atlas, have proved a compelling inspiration to students of architecture and architectural researchers. So I want to turn to Bird-Rose, as she spent so long being embedded in this Australian context in which many of us are sitting today. And I want to look at an essay that we find in the Arts of Living on a Damaged Planet book. It's called Shimmer, When All You Love Is Being Trashed. She speaks of the terrible clash of the, and I quote her, brilliant shimmer of the biosphere and the terrible wreckage of life in this era that we are coming to refer to as the Anthropocene, unquote. She explains how she learned about shimmer from the Aboriginal people of the Victoria River region of Australia's Northern Territory, a place to which she often returned over a period of 30 years. Shimmer, she explains, is what they call bir-yun, an experience of being part of a brilliant and pulsating world, enjoying a multi-species conviviality, and a scent that says yes to life. If we can move with the shimmer, then perhaps we, uniting in cross-species conglomerations, might find ways out of the bad habits of worldly wreckage and violence. Surely this is at the crux of what we are attempting to cope with today, a situation from the midst of which, or par le milieu, to borrow from Isabelle Stengers and Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari before her, a situation from the midst of which we must grapple, struggle, cope, stay with the trouble, another slogan that we've become familiar with from Donna Haraway, as well as listen and pay attention, whether we like it or not. Here we are mired in a field of immanence, and it is from the midst of this field we must work. Now, this is where I take issue, in fact, with the thought image of utopia that's framing the concerns of the panel today. Both it and affects such as hope might have to be placed to the side as not very useful concept tools after all. Utopia, after all, is nowhere and not here. And hope, perhaps, allows or encourages us to stall and put off action until tomorrow when we hope things might get better. Instead, from the messy midst of our fields of immanence, undertaking everyday acts of coping, sharing stories, and celebrating the shimmer when we fleetingly and joyously have opportunities to encounter it. How do we work here? As Bird Rose explains, the shimmer of life does indeed include us, human creatures too. I'm interested also in what we can learn, and I think this is really important and why we're sitting here together today, what we can learn as architects and design thinkers from the knowledge practices of the Feral Atlas about which we've heard. For instance, slow, careful, responsible ethnographic forays into the worlds of humans and non-humans, which direct us to the necessity of slowing down, of privileging collaborative work, of collectivizing our concerns. I think we've seen too today, looking at this wonderful work of Anna Tsing and her collaborators, that the importance of collaboration is key. And amidst this, the aesthetic modes of expression, which come from designers and architects as well, are so crucial to how the project is carried. Forms of expression work alongside the forms of content, whether in the form of delicate illustrations of mushrooms and spores, as we found in Anna Tsing's earlier work on mushrooms at the end of the world, or those watercoloured icons that float across the Feral Atlas platform, allowing us to enter into these fields that collage together historically specific detail. Whether it's the construction of a book such as Arts of Living on a Damaged Planet, where we have ghosts and stories proceeding from either end of the book, moving toward the centre. All of these aesthetic effects perhaps help us celebrate some kind of shimmer and encourage a joy despite all. Okay, I think I'm going to leave that for today, Rochus and Peter, and pass it back to you.
Thank you, Hélène. I just want to add, it's 200 to 400 regent honey eaters left in the world. So between here and Victoria, it's not just in this region. So they start changing their sing-song because they don't hear their own singing anymore with other birds. But Peter, to you.
Hélène, thank you so much for that provocation on the provocation. I think that raises some really interesting questions, and I think the idea of shimmer is something we might like to explore in the discussion, and certainly a few other issues about how we might educate architecture students and the challenges of doing that in a slow way. But before we get to the discussion, I think we've got to hear from Charity, who is certainly Charity's work and her ideas have really opened up my mind and expanded my horizons, particularly in relation to the Southern Ocean. So Charity, I will hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, hello everyone, and thank you Anna, Alder and Hélène for your discussions of knowing the Anthropocene and caring for a damaged planet. But I'm grateful also to Rochus and Hinkel, for inviting me to this panel and also for guiding it through these important discussions. My name, as we were saying, is Charity Edwards. I'm an architect and researcher, and I'm going to present a field report from the South, and from the Southern Ocean in particular. And in that reporting, I want to make sure that we attend to the ocean's deep and dark bodies, and bodies in its deep and dark, possibly feral bodies, but definitely something in the register of humans and non-humans making each other that we're alerted to by the Feral Atlas. So explorations in and of the ocean tend to reveal little of diverse ecologies, industrial histories, and urban imaginaries within. This makes the ocean seem redundant in the co-constitution of human and non-human relationships across a rapidly urbanizing planet. Even more troubling, architecture has largely failed to turn its attention to this vast liquid space that covers most of the Earth's surface. I have a sneaking suspicion this disregard may have something to do with a volume that is all interior. The Feral Atlas reminds us the Anthropocene is a set of incompatible scaled effects. And the scale of interiority I want to draw attention to today is an ocean experienced as an assemblage of power, technologies, and dynamic relations, all embedded within diverse overlapping ecologies. This interior is immediate, immersive, and improbably planetary. For the ocean presents an unexpectedly sheer physical obstacle that complicates claims for space beyond the simple object of the building and slightly more complex container of the city. It is vast, mobile, barely explored and under-researched, governed from a distance via overlapping legal regimes, constituted from materiality resistant to surveillance, and completely unsuited to attempts of human control, and always becoming an uncontrolled everywhere. Nevertheless, there is the almost total dismissal from current architectural debates of this significant volume. And for Lefebvre, this was a clear blind field, a masking maneuver that obscures and occludes, not just a simple act of selective focus, but rather an ideological not seeing that is also a not knowing. As a long-standing co-opted field, the ocean is increasingly severed from nature. Here, scientific and commercial infrastructures lay foundations for an urbanizing ocean, and pure wilderness representations falter as exploitation and global capital are acknowledged as long present in this space. Similarly, the unrelenting climate and geopolitical crises of the Anthropocene age declare there is no longer any outside to speak of in this world. As architectural theorist Ross Exo Adams notes, if interior was, for Benjamin, the space of withdrawal from the world, today interior has replaced the world. Withdrawal is no longer possible. Actually experiencing the planetary interior of the ocean requires us to approach an uncertain volume, relinquish assumptions of authority, and recognize relations with other beings, matter, and planetary processes beyond our control. Everyday life is entangled throughout the ocean with non-humans in ways that challenge the anthropocentric primacy we assume on land. Thinking through the ocean means we can reconfigure our relations to the world and of the world itself. In Hélène's 2018 book, Creative Ecologies, Theorizing the Practice of Architecture, she describes architecture as a thing which both produces and is produced by many environments. In this context, architecture is a designed technological apparatus that facilitates human exceptionalism and usually forgets the other lives it mingles with. So this field report highlights uneven and more than human transformations at the scale of the planet, especially in spaces still awkwardly conceived of as outside the city, the growing urbanization of the Southern Ocean. Though widely perceived as a pristine wilderness at the end of the Earth, the Southern Ocean is an urbanizing space and has been for at least 150 years via seal and whale hunting fields, animal processing factories situated in the subantarctic islands, heroic performances of exploration and nation building, monolithic commercial and mining speculation, and fishing and telecommunications testing. The Southern Ocean is, however, always held at a distance and experienced by most through tightly controlled and highly curated reportage and aspirational images. This wet volume reveals planetary scale interdependencies operating in long chains of historical transformation. And so unlikely that anthropologist Stefan Helmreich crucially claims what is required is more thinking from Southern Oceans. While whaling is now limited in this space, the exploitation of beings continues, even if they're not immediately visible to us as bodies implicated in urbanization. We could consider the co-opting of microbodies, genetic and biochemical resources, such as antifreeze proteins, krill oil, and other biological products that are increasingly prized by both private companies and public research organizations as commercial imperatives flow from scientific studies performed in the space of the Southern Ocean. Radical new technological bodies expanding into the ocean through scientific research and resource exploration, such as autonomous underwater vehicles and floating drone swarms, also present a new aspect for consideration. The growth of remote infrastructures for the non-living is a surprisingly new manifestation of urbanisation. While non-living typically refers to non-sentient objects or mineral resources, less attention has been paid to autonomous underwater vehicles as agents with intelligence, gathering data, mapping features, and communicating to shipboard, land-based or orbiting satellites. Even these rebranded good drones, including submersible robots like here used in marine science, were initially developed as a specific type of defence industry infrastructure in remote environments. The cyber infrastructure deemed critical to conduct science year-round in areas inaccessible to all except spaceborne monitoring systems. These deep and dark bodies exist at the intersection of surveillance and speculation. And the prospect of collectivized intelligences operating for thinly veiled commercial benefit within the ocean and beyond generates complex legal, ecological, moral, and spatial questions. Operationalizing the Southern Ocean for profit shifts our understanding of this space. No longer a remote wilderness, instead a vast urbanizing field embedded with technology and significantly unseen. Automated underwater vehicles constitute a radical new actor within this space, inorganic, lively, and suggestive of new forms of agency. They're also the producers of unique visual representations via integration with remote sensing, satellite surveillance, and locational technologies operating at a planetary scale. Paying close attention to the knowledges that these robots themselves co-create, often in the service for a growing drive for a smart ocean, allows for what sensory ethnographer Sarah Pink argues is the possibility of other voices to come into this murky representation. And this is where I see a distinct contribution can be made by urbanists, architects, interior designers, and other spatial practitioners. The future of inhabitation will surely rely on our capacity to descend to humans from the earth and articulate ways of living within its fragile conditions. As such, we should discard our landed bias, reconceive conventional spatial boundaries, and register entanglements beyond land-sea binaries that radically challenge assumptions regarding the delineation of inside and outside. Our obligation, perhaps, is to recognize and reconnect spaces in ways that provide insight and agency to more than human beings through experiences that span this planet.
Fantastic. Now, Rochus, do you want to kick off with a question for the panel, or do you want?
I've got a burning question. Yes.
You've got a burning question.
Yes.
Okay.
So no, I mean, thank you, Charity, for that presentation. The discussion is of course concerning everyone and humanity at large, but we also have to focus on what can we as a discipline, as educators, as researchers in architecture and spatial practices, as you said it, Charity, learn and enhance change. But my question is, we work with so many specialists and advisors and project managers. Do we have to change our practice, that we have to work more closely and maybe always with anthropologists, ethnographers, and ecologists? Because we had, like on our last panel on Monday, we had Barbara Klotchevsky, an anthropologist from Paris. Now we've got anthropologists and ethnographers on our panels. We work in the school, meanwhile, in some subjects closely with ecologists. I think maybe we need to tap into that knowledge and be really well informed. What are your thoughts on that, Hélène and Charity?
This is close to my heart. I actually started studying anthropology before I did architecture, and then followed my architecture study and practice for a while by studying environment in another degree. So the question that you ask is, do we need to learn this, or do we need to do this? And I mean, I think the only answer is, of course, yes. But that's not hard, right? You know, many professions work amongst different disciplines and collaborate with others. And I think perhaps it's the least we can do to actually stretch beyond what we think our kind of fairly rigidly defined profession is, and work and share and care with others. I mean, this seems like a kind of cliched answer, but yes.
Definitely. I totally agree with you, Charity. And I think it's interesting to think about how architects and spatial practitioners, as well as ethnographers, anthropologists, they all have vested interests in the field, and that we're sort of charting, whether in preparation or for purposes of understanding, and also in environment. So we very much share matters of concern, I would say, maybe with different emphases though. I was in preparing for this panel too, it's worth noting, I think it's quite interesting to see in terms of what architects do. One of the most famous prizes for architects is the Pritzker Prize. And this year, the French architects Lacatin and Vassal have won this prize. And now they're an architecture studio who are famous for finding answers to problems that might mean that, sometimes the answer is to do nothing. So they're very famous for sort of taking up an architectural problem and not proposing a building by way of response, but undertaking this careful, slow art of mapping a context, understanding its relations in terms of the social context and the material distributions, and saying, well, we don't really need to add anything more here. It's all working fine. And I think these reorientations we learn through our transdisciplinary, collaborations.
Yeah, I mean, I think from my point of view, it'd be interesting to hear what Alder and Anna think about these things, sort of observing architects, is that too often I think when architects talk about multidisciplinarity or crossing the disciplines, it's still just completely confined with the architecture and engineering community. That for them, it's like, getting someone to help you do a facade, getting some sort of thermal or sustainable engineer, getting some constructors and structural engineers and manufacturers all together. And I think what's really interesting about having a conversation that opens up with anthropologists and ethnographers and other people from the social sciences is getting a perspective that is kind of beyond that binding, that sort of binding nature of the construction and engineering industry. But I think, I don't know, Alder and Anna, what do you think of architects? And it's interesting, you've talked a little bit about Utopia, and I think, Alder, you mentioned that alterity is too often simplified. Do you think, as Hélène suggests, we should put Utopia to one side as architects? Should we begin to think about alterity in different terms and not utopian terms? I hope that makes sense.
Anna, would you like to go first?
Okay, sure. I have some responses to the last couple of things that maybe we'll come back to Utopia and stuff, but both the doing nothing and the underwater robots. And I'm going to play, if I may, in that world of materiality, admitting from the start that I don't know anything about underwater robots. But watching that, I thought, as a person informed in ecology, the first thing I would want to do in a design for underwater robots is, first of all, they have to be completely soundless. That, as you know, the communication in the ocean depends so completely on sound that everything from the tiniest shrimps to the greatest whales depend on sound. And so any mechanical device that makes any noise at all will spread thousands and thousands of miles and disrupt communication systems. So we've got to start with a completely silent, this is on the doing nothing category. If you want a robot, it cannot make any noises. And then I thought, well, how are you going to direct it? And I thought, well, why should you have to direct it? Maybe if it's just drifting and bobbing, that could be the best kind of underwater robot of all. That the kinds of drifting and bobbing that sea creatures do, from jellyfish to things with even less directionality than jellyfish, that the gentle motions in the water would be a perfectly great way to run an underwater robot, is to not allow it directionality and velocity. And I know this is pushing against the boundaries of what designers usually do, but perhaps that's some of the way that a transdisciplinary discussion with ecologists, anthropologists, and designers might get going to think past the boundaries of what we think we're expected to do. So that's just a beginning place for perhaps working against those modernist forms of mastery that we're all taught, whatever our disciplines, are the requirements of our jobs.
Yeah, I think architects are unfortunately steeped in the idea of mastery. And I think unfortunately masters, and we're trying to, I guess, sort of stamp out that thing. I think what interests me was the way that you used collage in Feral Atlas and the representation of things. I mean, I was particularly struck by the plan of the slave ship with the people partitioned within it, and also that other image of the sort of bow of the ship with the sort of feet. And I thought the range of different illustration techniques, the range of graphics and the sort of collage effects was really effective. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that? Was that intentional, or was it something that came about through the process?
It's absolutely intentional, and it was, as Alder has already spoken about, a way of stretching the concept of the map, that we imagine that maps should be ruled by a single GIS system. But from the first, we rejected that as a model that introduces so many mistakes, and that perhaps working across scales and with very different kinds of representations might in fact sometimes give us a closer read of ecological and social processes than the singular expectation of a GIS grid. So indeed, many of the kinds of what we call maps in Feral Atlas are hardly recognizable in an ordinary sense as maps, but perhaps clues of the ways we might need to open up representation to see the kinds of feral processes that are so central to the Anthropocene.
Yeah, and Alder, do you want to say a bit more about that?
Let me think about the question of collaging. I'll jump on a bit of a soapbox, and it'll bring me back to the first question about collaborations. So I have no other option than to admit that I am the least visually inclined member of the Feral Atlas team. My training is mostly in text and to some extent in music, but that was something I did as an extracurricular activity long ago. And one of the things that I think has been for me really eye-opening about the project is just that process of sitting and looking, considering visuals to be analytical texts in the same way that I might consider, a 50-page paper to be an analytical text. It was something that I hadn't ever been sort of encouraged or trained to do, and that was also, part of my own set of choices. But I think coming back to this question about collaborations and maybe also collage and a little bit about alterity, one of the things that these kinds of collaborations I think have the potential to do is push everybody on all sides to question the frame that they've come in with, often quite uncomfortably. Now, the best questions are usually not the ones that you can just sort of solve at the end of the day and go home and feel easily happy about. And I do think that looking from within those frames where you bring different forms of knowledge making into juxtaposition with each other in a conversation, in a process of design among many people, it does something to sort of break down any kind of uniform idea of utopia. Because my utopia will not be the utopia of the person sitting next to me, nor will it be the utopia of the person across the table. And I think there is something about that granular interaction that allows us to think about academic alterities in ways that can then fold out into other forms of alterity that we might be interested in.
Yep, got it. I think that's really interesting. And we might move to you, Charity. What do you think of this notion of, I suppose, these issues of mapping, how we might map particular landscapes? You know, architects and urban designers are obsessed with diagramming, and I think the kinds of practices that we see in the feral atlas are completely different to that. And do you want to reflect on your work in relation to the Southern Ocean, how you think it has been mapped previously through various technologies, and how you think it could be mapped if we were going to pursue alternatives and try and create some kind of alterity or consciousness that gives us, or something that gives us a different consciousness about such a vast landscape?
Yes, I mean, that's a good question. Thank you, Peter. That's a difficult question, of course.
Hope it wasn't too long.
No, but I think to begin with is I mean, we have to acknowledge that all maps are fictions, right? And so that can play into, I guess, a kind of commitment to storytelling as a way of thinking through futures, of thinking through differences, of thinking through other ways that the world might be. But it's to understand as well that those fictions have often been used to control and delineate and order space for such a long time, to the detriment of so many. And certainly the Southern Ocean plays into that. The Southern Ocean is not recognised by everyone. Its limits are kind of a bit wavy. The United States doesn't recognise that the Southern Ocean exists, so it calls things like the Southern Atlantic, the Southern Pacific. The Southern Ocean is, though, the only ocean in the world which completely traverses the globe without hitting dry land. And so it's generating the most incredible kind of current, which also helps mediate global temperature rise and is seen as some kind of saviour in a way for the predicament that we find ourselves in. And for a long time was seen as a kind of natural barrier against things like microplastics and what have you, entering the wilderness of the Antarctic region. But we now know that that's a fiction in and of itself, and those microplastics are found everywhere. And there is nothing left untouched, even if our maps suggest that this place is uninhabited and unpopulated. I mean, the Southern Ocean also, I mean, it's a very recent ocean, which seems like an odd thing to say. It was only kind of noted in the year 2000 as well. So for me, that's recent, you know, perhaps not for some people watching. And it brings to mind, I guess, some of the ways in which, how can an ocean be recent? How can we suddenly discover an ocean on this planet? And there are, of course, many stories and certainly some evidence in the subantarctic islands of Pacific Islander voyages down that way. And so the narratives that we attach to Cook and other kind of heroic explorers of this space are another layer of fiction being made into maps around this area. I mean, I guess my concern with things like the Southern Ocean is that they tend to get presented to us simply through maps and other images that work as maps, aspirational, curated images, for the most of us who never get a chance to visit, to explore or inhabit it. And in a way that starts to excise out from the planet one part of it, so that we have this kind of hope, this feeling that there is something left wild on the planet, and therefore the crisis is not as catastrophic perhaps as we should recognise it is. So while I continue to make my students quite depressed and frustrated by making them focus on mapping and certainly radical forms of cartography in lieu of diagrams and plan drawings, I can also know that I have very mixed feelings about maps. And perhaps I should continue to have those, right, as we continue on. I think we always need to be interrogating our own representations and our ways of making worlds, and certainly those that we have inherited from others.
Can I
Hélène,
maybe take
yes,
it back?
jump
Yeah,
in,
exactly.
go
I
for it.
want to take it back to Helene's comment on referring to Lakatoma's-san on doing less as architects or doing nothing, and as unlearning or maybe questioning, like, how can we unlearn the modernist forms of mastery? And as director of the Bachelor of Design, how do we bring that into education? So, I mean, we're talking about our, we all agree on this. The question is, how do we make a change? So we all have a role to play in this. So as a, director of Bachelor of Design, which is like the largest program here at the MSD or at the faculty of ABP, like, how can we bring this up as a topic and educate our students that this is relevant to their discipline and not necessarily the mastery of the nicest, sleekest, tallest buildings anymore?
Absolutely. And I mean, when addressing a broad design, of course, encompasses a number of different disciplinary directions. And at the University of Melbourne, the Bachelor of Design goes all the way from fine arts and music with a couple of courses to, engineering and computing. And so these students are very diverse. A large number of the disciplinary dedications, though, still use, or importantly use, the design studio as that most crucial pedagogical environment. And here, as educators, we're setting the problems or the brief that students attend to, and how we frame a problem and how we ask our questions that we ask students to respond to become really, really important. And this too, again, is I think where we learn from other disciplines, because if we're asking the wrong kind of questions, we're going to be requiring that students follow the wrong kinds of tracks toward perhaps more destructive practices than more ameliorative practices in relation to their local environment worlds. So I think there's a great power inside the brief that we set in the design studio and the kinds of problems that we think students should address. And I think it's very powerful that we've spoken a lot about modes of representation, because they are crucial, and it's interesting to think of those both in terms of artistic representation, but also importantly political representation. And I'm thinking a bit of how Latour articulates this actually, because there's also how we represent what we think is at stake to our colleagues. And so representation, of course, there are a number of really powerful tools here. And what I think Feral Atlas gives us, when we reflect on it from the point of view of design, is an understanding that our modes of representation don't have to be directed at the ambition of a final built form. Representation is inherently a mode of discovery and exploration, and even self-discovery. And so I think for our students, rather than setting them up with the conceit that what they're doing is preparing themselves for a built form, to rather shift the emphasis of what they're doing through all of their, whether it's collage or drawing or describing landscape section cuts, that these are modes of discovery, and dangerous modes of discovery too, because we're rendering something visible. And when we're rendering the world visible, we're making it available for exploitation. So this is also going back to what Charity was saying about the dangers in mapping. And if I can just go a little bit further, because this has really been on my mind. We sat with an Indigenous elder on the weekend, Nawit Carolyn Briggs, who's an important elder in our context in Melbourne. And there was a discussion around scar trees. So there are these very important, significant trees that parts of the tree are cut out to create a canoe or a shield or a little shelter for a baby. And there's a lot of craft in this, because the tree stays alive after you've made the cut. And, we're all aware in Melbourne, or most of us, that there are a number of very significant scar trees. And also there's been some controversies around a birthing tree recently, and they're spotted across this sort of, urbanized field that we're all living in. Sometimes they're more obvious than at other times. And I'd begun to wonder to myself, what would it mean to draw a map of all those significant trees. Well, the problem with drawing the map is that you make them open for potential sort of vandalism as a downside. So you both want to kind of be able to educate students to the presence of this Indigenous past and its real important presence, but also wary of the violence that might attract in rendering visible through mapping. Anyway, they're just some reflections. Yeah.
But can I invite you?
Yeah.
I mean, I want to actually, Peter and myself, maybe stepping back a little bit and having you guys also starting a conversation amongst each other. So maybe you might want to phrase the question for Charity, Alder, or Anna.
Absolutely. Yeah. We can all have a conversation together. No, and I did want to say, I mean, Anna and Alder, it has been really phenomenal to see the influence of the work that's been happening across a number of these projects as it's infiltrated design. We have our thesis projects, coming through at master's level this semester, and it was noted that there were many references to various of the works of Anna Tsing, and I think this is so valuable because it helps us shift our ethos and so forth. And now that's not really a question except to just say how excited we are to have you sitting on this panel, and how many of my students I know are going to be extremely excited to watch the YouTube launch. But maybe if we can go back to collaboration, because it seems to me right across all of the projects that Anna's been involved in, that collaboration really is key. And, I think this is really important for us. And I wondered whether either Alder or Anna could speak a bit more to even the difficulties of collaboration, because we can't assume that it's always easy either. But can we talk more about collaboration?
Well, let me say, just to get it started off, that I am completely jazzed at this point in my life about collaboration with architects and designers in particular, because working with Fei-Fei Zhou and Lily Carr, who were the two main architects in the Feral Atlas project, really just blew my mind, changed my idea of what was possible, and that the kinds of spatial analysis that they made possible by the kinds of techniques that they had learned by being trained as architects really made a big difference to me, and I hadn't been exposed to that before. So it was just a completely transformative experience for me. So one thing about that in terms of Feral Atlas is, if architects and designers would get interested in what we call the non-designed effects of infrastructures, including buildings and other things, I think it would be a fantastic direction for students and professionals to begin to help us think that part of what the Atlas documents is how blindness to those non-design effects has gotten us in huge amounts of trouble, has caused so many problems. So if we were to start to think systematically, we need the community of architects and designers to really help us think about all of those effects that were not built in to the initial mastery design, but came along anyway. So that doesn't answer your question about the difficulties of collaboration yet, of which there are many things to say, but I am just wildly enthusiastic about further collaborations. Fei-Fei Zhou and I are talking about a project to look, for example, at the kinds of coastal infrastructures in a place like Southeast Asia, where sea level rise and the sinking of land masses in particular areas are so important, and the kind of spatial imagination that she brings to helping the kinds of things that ethnographers are able to do, of learning the histories and maybe even the ecologies of this area, that this is an area where I think having architects and designers to work with ethnographers is an ideal situation for understanding so many of the issues involving climate change and the Anthropocene.
What's really hopeful about this too, I think, Anna, is that we can pick up architecture as a discipline and realign some of its ambitions, understand it has an incredible skill set, and that can be applied to other kinds of problems. I think that makes me very hopeful for our discipline. I don't know, I know charity students do wonderful work that looks a bit like this, that realigns the skill set. Do you want to talk a bit about that, Charity?
mean, yes, I'm always super grateful for those incredible students who are willing to kind of set aside what they've been taught before and think about what might happen if they let loose with their drawing and image making in other ways. But I think it's so funny to hear you say that, Anna, because I think for many architects, it's the involvement with other disciplines that have, and the methods coming from other disciplines that have enabled us to expand how we consider space, how we represent space, and how we analyse space in a really quite critical and expansive way. So for me, what you speak about there is completely the inverse from my experience. It's like, it's been so fantastic to kind of study and work with ecologists and people working with wetlands and geologists and astrophysicists that understand the different ways that they are both seeing and knowing other ways of thinking about the world, and being able to, in a way that is usually like a very bad part of being an architect, of having hobbyist concerns and rapidly appropriating other people's methods. This has actually enabled us to think more expansively, perhaps about world making, which is where I would like to see the discussions that students and I are having at the moment head more directly into. So yes, It's just like a big thanks for everyone else.
I think also the infrastructure question is one that's really close to my heart, because as a sort of rethinking of the scales of engagement of architects when they're kind of looking to urban and other contexts, and scale obviously, and it is an important point that's come through with the discussion of the Feral Atlas today. But with colleagues in Stockholm, we ran a studio dedicated to infrastructural love. So asking students to attend to the local infrastructures in the Stockholm context and understand in many ways exactly the unintended consequences, the stuff that happens in between the intentional design moments, and to attempt to map these. And one of the exercises that was part of that was to describe 100 infrastructural details that they had to draw. And in the very art of mobilising themselves through the environment, with a particular attention to the underground rail system, in drawing little details that looked like they were sort of a bit out of place, let's say, they had to pay attention, because when you have to draw something, you have to pay acute attention. And so certainly with my colleagues over the last couple of years before I moved back to Melbourne, understanding the integration of that architects need to look at infrastructures too. This isn't simply an engineering problem. We're totally embroiled in that question.
Yeah, I think that's right. I did have one question for Anna and Alder. Obviously, your work's pretty exciting to us as architects and urbanists. How has your work been received by other anthropologists? What do they think of these kinds of the Feral Atlas and the representations within it?
Well, I'm going to start with the difficult part and let Alder pick it up and say the positive thing. So the difficult part, which I have only come to understand in the last 2 months, is that a digital project has a lot of trouble, even though it has many of the qualities of a book, that is, in this case, a scholarly book, careful analysis, citation trails, professional training. In each of these cases, all of the care that one puts into a scholarly book was there. But publications don't want to review it because it's a digital project, and therefore they consider it just a light news. And I guess I'm saying this in the context of this panel, hoping that if there's listeners to the panel, they can contact one scholarly journal and say, or a public journal, and say, push your standards a little. Perhaps the kinds of books that are coming out as digital projects deserve a review. Alder, I'll let you speak to more substantively.
Oh, well, what I was going to say is it's actually a difficult question to answer at this point in 2021. The project was released in October of last year. right before the US presidential election, and with, rising COVID cases in the US and elsewhere, which has meant that we did have a panel on it at the AAA's, the previous AAA's, but it was before it was entirely completed. So the communication about it has had to be also, nearly entirely digital. Judging by our Twitter feed, the people have enjoyed going through it. We're still waiting a little bit to hear how the response to using it in teaching is. So I would urge any of you and anyone who's listening to teach with it, and then get back to us and tell us how it went, because that was also one of the driving ambitions at the beginning. And here I'm voicing something that Anna articulated initially, but that really stuck with me, which is that we, if you feel strongly that we're living in a moment of environmental crisis, it's also a moment when you can't wait until the last class meeting to engage students in something that might get them to sit up and take notice and think about how they can have an effect in the world. So in putting it together, we had that question very present too, of how can we get people to feel awake and alive and responsive to this moment when they're learning about these things in an undergraduate or graduate classroom for the first time.
No,
So an invitation, please, if you teach it, get back to us, and please teach it.
I'm very happy to let you know that in a master's level seminar I'm running called Design, Philosophy, Architecture, we have a week dedicated to the Feral Atlas.
Hooray.
Yeah, so I can totally get back to you, and I can already tell you that students have been dipping into it and getting very inspired, because the task that each of my students have, and we have a couple of landscape students, and I think there's a graphic designers, but mostly architects, is that they have to follow a material throughout the full semester and pay a lot of attention to it, whether it's like something like MDF or someone's got chalk and we've got iron ore. Most of these materials at some point or another enter the construction industry, and they have to read all the theory, sometimes through the point of view of the material, or by just paying a lot of attention to the material, getting to know the material more and more, and they have to gradually accumulate a story of that material as it intersects with the theory through the term, and they have to produce something like an environmental storybook at the end. So giving them, I don't know, lots of
sounds fascinating.
Yeah, from all the work that's being done by you guys.
Well, let me address the conceptual thing, because Alder decided not to on that, which is, I think the potential is there in Feral Atlas for exactly the kinds of things that Charity was talking about mixing up within a discipline where architects need to learn from geologists, hydrologists, and all kinds of other fields. That our goal was to allow the kinds of separations that have held back the academy for so many years, in which natural scientists and humanists and artists can't speak to each other very well, that by this focus on the non-design effects of infrastructure, that we hope to have created a research paradigm, perhaps a suggestion for methods in which both natural scientists, where there's more than two here, natural scientists, humanists, artists, and others could find an important contribution in which they can't design research without mixing it up with the methods and skills from other disciplines. So that's our goal, is to create a world where young researchers, and perhaps older ones too, might refocus the kinds of research problems that they think are addressable through this way of understanding where disciplinary boundaries are getting in our way and where there might be new openings.
And I think you foreground that talk of method as well, and that's so important, is what I'm finding definitely as both a practitioner and a researcher and an educator. Like, everyone is like 15 different things already, in the world today. And it's that way of ensuring that research is also doing, right? It's not just sitting back and observing. There is no disentanglement of ourselves from the things at which we look at. We are all embedded within it. So the making and the doing, being part of the thinking and the reflecting and observing, I think they're the methods that Feral Atlas are very helpful in helping us explain to students and provide ways of doing for students that they themselves, I think, are reaching out for.
I know we must be running out of time a little bit, but I would really love to go back to this question of alterity that Alder has raised as well. And alongside this, and it continues with the interdisciplinary stuff as well also, but where we're seeking out knowledge and knowledge practices, and the ways in which some knowledge practices have been so disregarded because our paradigms have been, emphasized as sort of modernist forms of mastery so much. But Alder, I'd love to hear a little bit more about this question of alterity with respect to knowledge practices and how we can learn to listen to other kinds of knowledge practice.
Oh, that's a very good question. An anthropologist would probably say something, I mean, as I am, would say something about participant observation. That would be the stock answer. No, the stepping back and sitting quietly and trying to be unobtrusive and just paying attention to what's going on around you. And I think that I keep coming back to that in a little bit of writing that I've been doing about some of these questions as a really critical starting point. It's one that, maybe it feels a little bit too simple and trite, but I think walking through the world and taking the time to look at it seems to me to be really quite important. But I think part of what I have been thinking about a little bit lately, and maybe it also relates to this question of how spaces for digital communication are designed, is also how you let people express themselves on their own terms, how to form a space where people are actively able to create their own terms of knowledge or of relationship with if it's a physical or a spiritual relationship with place, rather than heavily prefiguring that. The internet and digital spaces are much more flexible mediums for that kind of creativity, but they also still have particular forms or particular standards of interaction that can constrain as much as they open. So I outrun my headlights a little bit when I think about that in terms of building physical spaces, but in terms of thinking about how one might generate a knowledge space where those forms of expression are encouraged and cultivated, that's sort of what's on my mind.
Can I add a little bit?
Yes.
I think part of how Feral Atlas tries to deal with the problem of multiple forms of knowledge production is through making a variety of kinds of horizontal transfer from one field report to another possible. In some cases, for example, we have 2 field reports on the same topic, that for kudzu, an invasive weed of the Southeast United States, we have some 2 ecologists writing about the history of how it became an invasive weed, and then we have a photographer with some very haunting photographs of the kudzu that she's seen that's smothering trees. And so in that way, by asking users to work back and forth across different knowledge forms, we have 2 entries on salmon lice and other salmon pests, one by First Nations Indigenous leader of Canada, and another by an anthropologist who's been working with fisheries. And so each of them shows you a different way of doing empirical work. So each of them is grounded in a kind of empiricism, but different kinds of empiricism. So we're hoping that users, by making a journey from one to another, we'll be able to see how these come together to sediment, not just as particular universes on their own, but as overlapping and influencing each other to create a kind of planetary phenomenon that's not homogeneous, but that is constitutively heterogeneous in its knowledge practices.
And maybe that gets back to what Hélène was saying about putting utopia to one side, because I think certainly in architecture, utopia is driven by an idea about modernity and solutions, and creating, I think in some ways, quite simplistic solutions at times that tends to overlook or foreclose different ways of knowing. And I think, Hélène,
sorry, because I think that's a very Anglo-Saxon interpretation of utopia. So in the bicultural context, it also has a positive drive. And I mean, what's the alternative? It's dystopia. And I'm trying to get students excited about alternatives rather than getting them frustrated about what they're in. I mean, they have to understand their context and that we really have to act. But I think this utopian idea, which we have in the title, which I drive in the studio design context, I think is really to imagine a better world. And then what would that be? And the step there is yeah, well, you give either up or you start rethinking and changing and taking that positive outlook as a, a spin and as a source for your energy to actually fight all these fights you have to fight on the way to get there. So, but that's a comment. Might be really a cultural difference in interpretation, but I think I took the chance to bring it in.
Perhaps there are also more things than just utopia. Perhaps there are more things than just either utopia or dystopia. Perhaps that's another binary we might want to dismantle.
I think, I mean, I was going to go on and say that those notions of Deborah Bird-Rose notions of shimmer and the notion of drifting and bobbing, if we are to bring in the notion, if we put it to one side and forget about it, the way that it's been simplistically pursued by, let's call them parametricists, I didn't say that, but if we were going to come back to it, maybe creating utopias or creating those sorts of hope for the future is about close observation. It is about this notion of shimmering, and that has certain connotations for me, and also drifting and bobbing, rather than it always being an instrumental or productive kind of moment or impulse, which, I don't know, Hélène, what you would think about that, if you want to talk a bit more about shimmer, because I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, and of course this is something, Deborah Bird-Rose is a really astonishing, the late Deborah Bird-Rose, a very astonishing writer, and I thought it would be wonderful to cite her work, both because it intersects with Anna Tsing's projects, and because Deborah Bird-Rose is speaking to our context in Australia, and also demonstrating that I'm really taken by the fact that especially in ethnography, I know that spending a long time in a place is really important. And I often get worried that the way that research funding happens these days, that spending a long time and slowing down is exactly what we're not allowed to do. And it's exactly what we do need to do. But with this beautiful essay on the shimmer, which Deborah Bird-Rose explains that she learns from her immersion in the Australian context, learning from, Aboriginal peoples, it's very important to understand that the shimmer only emerges as an event because it operates in contrast to that which is dull or quiet. So it has this emergent quality and you encounter it and it does something to you and it affects you. But also it stands in contrast to moments when necessarily things are quiet or dulled. So she speaks a lot about that kind of rhythm of the shimmer and its emergence, which I think is enormously compelling, speaking to the immediacy of the encounter, not even, being open to that and listening to it, paying attention to it, all of these sorts of modes of ethical comportment that I think are really important. And I mean, I take what Rochus is saying about different cultural connotations around the concept, the very heavy concept of utopia, but for me it is absolutely directed toward a future and demands that we forget about where we are right now, here and now. I for my own practice want to put it to the side and work instead with notions such as immanence, and here is where I draw on a long scholarship in the work of Deleuze and Guattari, who I've been working with, and then also feminist theorists who take up on various of their thinkings as well, where there's a focus absolutely on immanence, how we cope with the here and now, how we get by par le milieu, acknowledging the direct environmental relations we're in the midst of, how we work with that empirical material and pay our due respect to it. It's just the orientation that I think is far more important for us to focus on. So I really want to defend the placing utopia to the side. And Rochus and I can argue about it more later.
Yes, I was thinking maybe that might happen later over a topic. I mean, I think my approach to, I mean, for me, utopia is kind of an ambivalent thing. I remember in 2011 or 10 or whatever it was, the Biennale, Architecture Biennale, the Australian Pavilion got 17 people to propose what the Australian city of 2050 would be like. And I think at least 8, 9, 10 of those projects were semi-utopic or semi-dystopic visions of flooded cities. And I think in a way it's kind of, you know, and I'm sure if you went back and did it again, you would still end up with a lot of flooded cities. And I think that kind of thing, or those kinds of representations are a little bit simplistic. Charity, what do you think about these issues of utopia in your own research and teaching practice, and particularly in the context of the Southern Ocean? Is the Southern Ocean seen as a site of utopia for some, maybe for sort of geopolitical interests or mining interests? I'm not sure.
So I'm going to make Rochus angry here and completely deny my own Germanic heritage by saying I too have like extreme problems with the concept of utopia and are thinking about a future that precludes real care for the present. You also don't get to go through life with a name like Charity and being part of a family tradition which includes names such as Hope and Faith for all in your family without thinking about these ideas quite deeply. And I too have no time for hope. And I think that for me is the driving thing. I do teach a history theory unit for urban planning and design where we look at sustainability and we look at the Brundtland report and we think about what was intended by sustainability back in the 1980s. And perhaps if we had done something then, we might have this place for hope now, but we are, you know, close to 40, 50 years beyond that, and things have gone tremendously awry. I don't know that your thoughts of utopia or processes towards them help us when things are so devastating as they currently are. I mean, visions of flooding cities are, it's like a terrible fetish that architects reel out all the time, right? When we have like live examples of that in Jakarta and Western Sydney, where it's here and it's now and it has been for long times, and it's often the result of poorly thought out infrastructural moves deployed in the most kind of least advantaged parts of society that we already have. But this is a problem since the 19th century, and to kind of render it as a provocative thought or guess for the future, for me, it seems tremendously insulting for everyone who exists in those conditions now.
And I think that
anything about the Southern Ocean, I'm sorry, Peter.
No, that's all right. I think Anna Tsing's idea of like doing a workshop or a studio based on coastal regions in Southeast Asia is, you know, pretty compelling one. I think the other thing I would say in response, I think and I mean, I sort of agree. I mean, I've got to agree with both Hélène and Rochus, because I'll agree with those because they're both my colleagues. But in a way, utopia has a kind of, I mean, we have a timing problem now, whereas I think in the past, in, you know, sort of with a sort of modernity mindset and utopia, we didn't have a timing problem. we didn't have a problem that we're being told that we need to do these things by 2030, 2040 or 2050, or we're going to face, even more existential threat. So I wonder if that timing problem then changes or should change the way that we think about utopia. But maybe we can, I don't know what Anna and Alder think. I mean, these are the sorts of things that architects argue about all the time. Particularly
Utopia is only 5 years away.
Like
that's
utopia,
one master.
Right.
One educational cycle, bachelor and master, is 5 years. You get that thought into students' head, and that's how far it is away. 5 years. They go into industry, and that's how they're going to change the world, hopefully, because otherwise we're really in trouble. We are already. I totally agree.
Deborah Bird-Rose has another beautiful concept, which she calls multi-species knots of time, in which she tries to draw attention to all of these kinds of temporalities around us that we don't pay attention to because we're thinking only of the kind of time of progress, and that these coordinations of, pollination, of all of the kinds of things that keep us alive is a readjustment to temporality, it seems to me, that would really help us think about what we're doing in the present. But to try it and say, one way that perhaps some of the impulse towards utopia could be done, I'm also think of the philosopher Sylvia Winters, who tries to look at the emancipatory possibilities in the present. So it's not just ignoring what the possibilities, but to ask, even in the most problematic concepts like humanity, if there might still be some kind of emancipatory project that could potentially grow out of them. So it's a way of salvaging some of the desire to ask always about what kinds of potential our moment has.
I think that makes a very nice connection to actually the panel we just had the first panel in the series on Indigenous knowledge system, where it was also we had the discussion about temporality and slowing down and connecting with our environment, and what Alder said, stepping back and listening, and not just coming in with a plan, but actually trying to understand what actually is happening. I'm aware of the time. Peter, are we coming to an end? Does anyone? Yes. So I'd like to thank you all for really sharing this space. I think we had a nice and interesting flow and discussion, but I think we also followed our goal and agenda to be hopefully influential and raise questions within our community and our education, and inspire our future architects going into the profession and going through this study. Big topics and complex issues. How can we make a start to engage? And we have to. And I'm not talking about a distant future. I'm hoping for a very close response to this. Peter, you want to go?
Well, I think it's been a great discussion. So I'd like to thank all the panelists, and hopefully we can see you again sometime. I know Alder is in northern Arizona, is that correct? What particular city are you in, Alder?
Flagstaff. Flagstaff.
Oh, Flagstaff. I've been to Flagstaff. So, yeah. And thank you, Anna, as well. And thank you, Hélène. And a special thank you, Charity, because I think your work, I think you've really, looking at some of your work, which I know, you've really expanded my mind in thinking about geography and many other issues concerning the Anthropocene. So I think before we finally finish, I'd like to mention that tonight's discussion was part of Melbourne Design Week, and we'd like to thank Philippa Knack-Becker and James Rafferty for their support in the production of this panel. And again, I have to thank my co-host, Rochus, who's really thought through these panels, really instigated them instigated them and done so much hard work to get them all together. So thank you again, Rochus, and I hope the discussion about Utopia hasn't caused you too many problems after this. And I think we've got one more to do, haven't we, Rochus?
Yes, thanks, Peter. And yes, so we had a discussion a couple of days ago on Indigenous knowledge system, and we had the one tonight. And now I'd like to draw your attention to Thursday night, April 1 at 7 o'clock Melbourne time. We have our last in the series during the Melbourne Design Week, Politics and Utopia and Architecture, Shaping Future Societies. Now it comes again, the word, a discussion around utopian architecture, utopian societies, historical examples, and socio-political experiments. Do architecture and architects have the potential to enhance necessary future societal changes? A nice continuation of what we discussed today. So can we address, and how can we address our current crisis, from climate collapse and the loss of biodiversity to social injustice? Does architecture have an agency? I left utopian away in my script here. So this panel will be with Dr. Felicity Scott, Professor of Architecture from the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, Columbia University, and Associate Professor Dr. Lee Stickles from the University of Sydney, and Dr. Jonathan Lovell, an architectural historian whose research explores architecture's potential as a medium of communication. Also, again, a very good link. I think we really played them well together, those three panels, Peter. Thanks everyone for listening. Thanks for joining in. Spread the word. You also can go back and watch it on our YouTube channel and use it in your future teaching. Have a good night, everyone, and thanks again to everyone on the panel.